Lifecycle of a data source object in Java database connectivity. Here you can see lifecycle of a data source object. Data source defined in Java.SQL package is an abstraction layer for Java database applications. Database applications may use JNDI context to find data source attributes that are configured on the deployment server. You can obtain data source objects in two ways, using JNDI without using JNDI. JNDI is an API accessing different kinds of naming and directory service. JNDI is not specific to a particular naming or directory service. It can be used to access many different kinds of system, including file systems, common, object request, broker architecture, COBA, Java remote method invocation, RMI, and enterprise Java beans, EGB, as well as directory services such as lightweight directory access protocol, LDAP, and a network information service, NIS. Although you can use JDBC to access a set of relational databases, you can use JNDI to access a set of naming and directory services. You will from a portability point of view, the obtaining data source interface using JNDI is more portable than not using JNDI. The data source interface provides an alternative to the driver manager class, making a connection to a data source using data source implementation is better for two important reasons. It makes code more portable and it makes code easier to maintain. A data source object represents a real-world data source. Depending on how it is implemented, the data source can be anything from a relational database to a spreadsheet or a file tabular format. When a data source object has been registered with the JNDI naming service, an application can retrieve it from naming service and use it to make a connection to the data source it represents. For example, JDK 1.4 documentation defines javax.sql.datasource as follows: a factory for connection to the physical data source that this data source object represents, an alternative to the driver manager facility. A dataset object is a preferred means of getting a connection. An object that implements the data source interface will typically be registered with the naming service based on the JNDI API. Data source interface is implemented by a driver vendor. Three types of implementation exist. Basic implementation produces a standard connection object. Connection pooling implementation produces a connection object that will automatically participate in connection pooling. This implementation works with the middle tier connection pooling manager. Distributed transaction implementation produces a connection object that may be used for distributed transaction and almost always participates in connection pooling. This implementation works with the middle tier transaction manager and most always with the connection pooling manager. Data source object has properties that you can modify when necessary. It is, for example, if the data source moves a different server, you can change the property from the server. Benefits: the benefit is because the data source's properties can be changed. Any code accessing that data source does not need to be changed. A driver that is accessed via a data source object does not register itself with the driver manager facility. Rather, a data source object is retrieved through a lookup operation and then used to create a connection object. With the basic implementation, the connection obtained through a data source object is identical to the connection object obtained through a driver manager facility. This is according to structs. As a rule, you should always use a connection pool to access a database. The data source interface is preferred way to implement the connection pool today. Many containers and database systems now bundle a data source implementation that you can use. Most often, the data source is made available through JNDI. The JNDI approach makes it easy for you to use business classes to access data source without worrying about who set it up. When connecting to a data source, a relational database such as MySQL or Oracle, using a data source object registered with the JNDI naming service rather than using the driver manager facility, and you get 3 benefits. It makes code more portable, it makes code easier to maintain, and you get benefit of connection pooling. For example, in JDBC 2 introduced the data source interface that eliminates connection URLs and driver names in your Java applications. Data source enables you to register using JNDI naming instances of the data source with unique name. Then the other application can retrieve the registered data source using unique name. A data source object provides a new method for JDBC client to obtain a DBMS connection represented as java.sql.connection. Data source object is usually created, deployed, that is registered and located, lookup operation, and managed separately from Java application that use it. This figure shows the life cycle of a data source object. In this figure, note that the directory and naming service item in JNDI enabled and can bind, register, and hold number of data source objects. Most databases can use COBA based naming and directory services, but in order not to tie yourself with the specific implementation of JNDI, in this chapter here you see to use the file system based reference implementation of JNDI SPI driver from JavaSoft. In real production applications, you should select a commercially available naming and directory service product, such as, for example, older Sun's directory server or Novel's directory server, and so on. One Java application 1, can create data source using some data source configuration from an XML file, a relational database, or a file-based system. Also, Java application 1 can register or bind and manage the created data source in registering a data source. You have to associate the data source with the unique key. Once the data source is registered, it is accessible to other applications such as application 2. The application 2 can get registered. The application 2 can get registered data sources using lookup method by providing the unique key. Some vendors such as BEA's WebLogic and IBM's WebSphere provide tools to deploying data source objects and then provide browsing lookup operations to get data source objects. Here you can see application 1 is connected to create the data source via create, and here created data source is connected to directory and naming service, and deployed data sources via deploy here, and it is connected to create data source via manage. Here the Java application 2 is connected to directory and naming service and deployed data source via lookup, and here the directory and naming service and deployed data sources are connected to the application 2 via data source. Now this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for watching it.